And now we turn to Daf Yutes Amid Beis, and we have the last part of the Mishnah. Ubishas haregel shabasa meruba af evarim mutaros. That if it's during the regel, when there's a large volume of meat, because the people are coming to the Beis Hamikdash, and they are bringing their Meiser Sheni money, and they're buying meat for shlomim. So then, af evarim, even if it's left in larger piece of meat, mutaros. Meaning, if we weigh the two possibilities, whether or not it is nevela because it's evarim, or it's basar kosher because it is rov b'shas haregel rov habasar who basar kodesh, or basar kosher, I should say. So that we tip the scale and we assume that it's basar kosher. Now we learned in the Mishnah that if you find most on the harabayis, then you assume that they are chulin. So the Gemara asks, "Lo tzarcha de lo ba'harabayis kodesh." Doesn't the Tan of Mishnah have to tell us that on harabayis the most should be assumed to be kodesh because they came from the Trumas Halishka, Rebbe Ba, Rebbe Chia, B'Shem Rebbe Yochanan, Chazaka Shein Kohen Motzi Min Halishka Mos Achu Mechalon Al Behem. As soon as the Kohanim get to the Trumas Halishka and they take Mos out of the Trumas Halishka, they're not going to play any games. They're not going to take any chances. They're going to immediately be Mechalel the Mos on a Behema, the Behema which is going to be used as a Korban Tzibur. And therefore, we can assume that any Mos that we find on the Harabayis are Mos of Chulin. Now we have to give a little bit of an introduction to the next sugya. And that's the issue of what's called Hesech Hadas. And this is the Gemara that we learned in Psachim on Daf Lamed Dalet. When we have Kodshim, then we have to keep our eye on the Kodshim constantly. If we ignore the Kodshim and we get distracted and we're not shomer them, then we have to be concerned about the possibility that Nagu Bahen Tuma, that some Tuma came in contact with the Kodshim and passes the Kodshim. And the Gemara in Psachim presents a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about Hesech Hadas. Rabbi Yochanan says that in Kodshim with Hesech Hadas, it's a suffix. We don't know, lest perhaps it was in contact and contracted Tuma, or it did not. And mitzad suffix, we have to passel the Kodshim. If Eliyahu Hanavi would come, and he would testify to the fact that there was no maga of Tuma with these Kodshim, then Enochinami, the Kodshim are considered Kodshim Torah. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, holds that this psul of Hesech Hadas is psul aguf. The Chachamim made a special mile in Kodshim, and if there's Hesech Hadas from the Kodshim, then it's possible, not for Torah suffix, because maybe, perhaps, it came in contact with Davar Mitame, but even if it wasn't Tomei, nevertheless, it's possible. And that's called a psul aguf. Even if Eliyahu Hanavi would come and testify that these Kodshim had absolutely no contact with the Davar Mitame, they would still be possible. Now, in our sugya, it seems that the psul of Hesech Hadas is a suffix psul. Why? Because the Mishnah says that we wait until Ibur Tzura. We have to allow a amount of time to pass within the allotment of time for Achila, so that now the basar becomes Nosa. Because the Mishnah holds we can't burn Kodshim in a case of suffix. We have to wait till it becomes Vade Nosa. But according to Reish Lakish, who holds that the psul of Hesech Hadas in this case where we find basar and nobody is paying attention to the basar, that is a psula guf. And therefore, it seems totally superfluous and unnecessary for the Mishnah to insist that we wait until Ibur Tzura. Now, in fact, our Gemara here in Shekalim is going to present a machlokes about this law in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Basar shenimtzu ba'azora, evarim olos chatichos chatos, Yushalayim zivchei shlomim, but zevazeh to ubar tzuraso v'yetzei lebeis hasreifa. In all these cases, we have proofs one way or the other whether to classify them as olos, as chatos, as shlomim. But in all cases, the Mishnah says we cannot eat the basar and we cannot burn the basar until after we wait till the ubar tzura. Omar Rab Loza b'shem Rab Elshaya, Hisiach das to'un ibur tzura, which means that our Mishnah supports the view of Rabbi Yochanan that in the case of Hesach Hadas, the psul is a psul of Tumah. We're afraid that maybe the basar contracted Tumah, and it's a din of suffix. There's no absolute psul aguf b'toras vadai, and therefore we need to wait before we burn this until Ibur Tzura, until it's possible b'toras vadai be din nosa. Amar Rav Hoshaya, Masnisa Amar Kei. The Mishnah certainly supports this view, and the Mishnah says to Uber Tzura, so v'yetzil beis hasreifa. We wait until to Uber Tzura until we know for sure that it's nosar, and then and only then are we allowed to burn it. But we cannot accept the principle of Ishlakish that Isiach Das is a psul aguf. It's a vadai, because then it's totally redundant and unnecessary to wait until you to Ubar Tzura. Rabbi Yossi, Yos. The Yos is a rhetorical question in the Yerushalmi. It means, is there really an absolute proof from Ab Mishnah? It's possible to interpret Ab Mishnah that it's not based at all upon Hesech Hadas. The Mishnah has something totally different in mind. And that is, the Ochlo Einato Yochel Shemen is Kalkel Tzuras. In other words, we don't know exactly how long ago this basar was lost. And it may look like fresh meat, such that we assume the shchita, etc., took place very recently, but maybe not. And maybe this basar itself is nosar. That's why we're not allowed to eat it. And lefum kain sarach lomar. Now we understand why the Mishnah requires that we wait to burn it until to ubar tzura v'yetzil beis hasreifa. So enochinami, Hesech Hadas is a psul aguf, and we don't have to wait until Ibur Tzura. But our Mishnah is concerned with Shemen Iskalkel Tzuras, which means maybe it's Nosar. And therefore the Mishnah says, we'll wait until it's Vadai Nosar. The Mishnah says, Nimtzu Begvulin, if we find Basar outside of Yerushalayim, if we find it Avarim in large limbs, then it's Nevela. If we find it chopped up into smaller pieces, then we assume it's kosher. Rav Krispa, B'Shem, Rav Yossi, Rav Chanina, when it says in our Mishnah Avarim, we find it in large pieces, is Nevelos, does that mean therefore it's Osur B'Achila, because we have to worry about the possibility that it's Nevela? No. It's not a possibility that it's Nevela, but it's Nevela Vada. Lokin aleh mishum Nevela. The very fact that you found it a varim in large limbs, that's absolute proof positive that it is a Nevela. If it was basar kosher, you would not find it a varim. And therefore, if somebody would go ahead, heaven forbid, and eat this meat that you found a varim, he would get malchus. And Masnis Amrakein, I'll prove it to you from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Evrei Nevelos, if you find it in a varim, it's Nevela. Chatichos mutaros. If you find it chopped up into small pieces, cut up, then it's mutter. Well, from the fact that the Mishnah lumps those two together in one breath, is chatichos mutaros lo mamish? Mutaros we don't take literally. It means mutaros that we have proof positive that it's kosher meat. Udekavasay evarim nevelos. That loken aleh mishum nevela. So that just like mutaros is vadai, so too nevela is vadai, and you get malchus. Rav Krispa b'shem Rav Yossi Rav Chanina, he says that this law that you find basar in gvulin evarim is nevelos. That's only if you find them, thrown out in the street. But imayu machrozos, if there were evarim that were kshurim bechut, in other words, he strung them together in a string, then mutaros, because with an avela, a person would not bother taking pieces of nevela and tying them together in a string. He would just throw them to the dogs or throw them into the rubbish bin. Now here I wanted to point out a very important addition here. It's not the practice to string together limbs of nevela. Pieces of meat are strung together only if the owner wishes to keep them, but not if he wishes to dispose of them. Moreover, it would seem that this ruling applies even with respect to the first part of our Mishnah, regarding limbs, evarim, that are found in the Azara. If the limbs are strung together, then they are permitted, because sacrificial meat, meaning karbanos, is never strung together. And that's the Tosefta. Strung together limbs, therefore, are assumed to be chulin meat that were brought into the Azar for the Kohanim to eat together when they eat the basar karbanos, because the sacrificial meat be eaten in a matter of royalty in a state of seis. Fine, okay. So again, we have proof positive that even in a case where you find basar in the Azara, it's chulin. Now the Gemara brings a very, very famous brisa. You've got a city that has nine treifa butcher shops and one kosher butcher shop, and it's chalfulo. He doesn't know where he bought his meat. Is choshesh. He has to be concerned with the possibility that he came from one of the nine nevela butchers. Now, who would go into a butcher shop that's nevela? But the answer is nevela is cheaper, and if he has a dog to feed, maybe he was buying meat for his dog. Nimtzeis. If, on the other hand, he finds a piece of meat out in the street, it's not that he went into one of the stores, one of the butcheries, and he doesn't remember which one he went into. And in this case, the basar would therefore be nevela. But in the next case, 9 out of 10 are kosher butcher shops. Only 1 out of the 10 is selling nevela. Nischalflo, he doesn't remember which one he went into. Choshesh, we apply the principle of kol kavua kemechzal mechzedam, because now the suffix is in the chanuyos. We don't know which chanus it came from, and if we don't know which chanus it came from, or I should say even more precisely which chanus he went into, then he has two categories of butcheries. It doesn't matter that there's 9 butcher shops that sell kosher meat. The one that sells treifa meat is selling it cheap, and he wants to feed his dog. Maybe he went in there, so that's kemechzal mechzedam. Ulenimtzeis, however, if he finds meat out in the street and he doesn't know where it came out of, holchem achar arov, since most of the butcher shops are selling kosher meat, we can assume that this is kosher meat. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, nimtza biad nachri kin nimtza beflatya. If you find meat in the hands of a guy, you can assume that the same din that would apply in a case we found meat out in the street. We're not going to ask any questions about which butcher shop the guy went into. Finding it in the hands of a guy is like finding it on the street, and therefore we go basar ro. And the Gemara is going to object. Wait a minute. The guy is going to certainly buy treifa meat, is he not? Rabbi Lazar Bey Rab Chagai, Havi Masmich le Rabbi Mana. which is a phrase that indicates that he was sort of leaning on Rabbi Mun. And Chama, and they notice Chad Arami, a non-Jew, Mekata min Suse. This is really wild. He chopped off a piece of his horse. I don't know if it was a live horse or a dead horse. It sounds like it was a live horse. Umapik Libra, and he goes out Libra to the outside, meaning to the shuk, and he's selling horse meat. Amalei, so Blaza says to Rabbi Mana, Hadoi, the Omer of Yochanan, Nipsabi Adnochri Knipsabi Flatio? How could it be that Rabbi Yochanan made a statement that if we find meat in the hands of a guy, then it's like meat that you find in the street. And if most of the butcheries in town are kosher butcheries, we can assume it's kosher meat. How can that be? Here I see the meat in the hands of the guy, and it's horse meat. Amalei, so Rav Mana responds to Rav Lazar, you misunderstood Rabbi Yochanan. Kain Omer Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi, my Rebbe, meaning Rabbi Yochanan, V'hein shero osa yotzei makulin shal Yisrael. What Rabbi Yochanan meant was that there was an area, a marketplace, that was a Jewish marketplace, and he saw the guy going into that marketplace. Then we could go bust a rove and assume that the meat that the guy is holding on to came from rove butcheries, which are kosher. But obviously, if we see that the guy is holding on to meat, we have no reason to assume that that meat is kosher meat. Another story. Chad Barnash b'Tziporin, a person in the city of Tzipori, Ozil boy mizbun kupad min tabacha. He went to try to buy meat from a butchery, and it turns out that the seller, the owner of this geschäft, was an enemy of this Jew who came in to buy meat. V'lo yovla. He says, "I'm not going to sell you meat. Get out of here." He throws him out. This is like a mice of Churva Bayis Sheni. Anyway, Amalei l'chad romai. So this Jew, who was the potential buyer, but he was refused, he figures he's going to outsmart his enemy who doesn't want to sell it. So he goes over to a guy, the Isile, and he gives money to the guy, and he says, "You go buy the meat from that vendor on my behalf." And that's exactly what happened. He bought the meat. The Jew who was selling it, he didn't realize this meat was earmarked for his enemy. He thought it was me selling it to a guy. Amalei. So now the one who outsmarted the vendor, meaning the buyer, lo nasiv al korcha. He says, against your will, I did a trick, Rama, and I made this guy my shliach, and he bought it on my behalf. Hamalo. So the owner of the butchery says, you didn't outsmart me. Lav basin avela obviously. He came in as a guy. I sold him to a guy. I sold him the vela. You all right, Jerry?
Yeah.
So I sold him the vela. You think you got a piece of kosher meat, my friend? I got news for you. What you got is non-kosher meat, and therefore you're not allowed to eat it. Now, normally, do we trust a person to say that meat that we would otherwise assume is kosher because all the meat in his butchery is kosher? Now he comes along after it was already sold, and he says, "Well, this one piece of meat came from, it was nevela." So do we trust him? Rabbi Yirmiyah b'Shem Rabbi Chanina Maisa Zeh Bolifnei Rebbe. A similar situation in the city of Tzipori came in front of Rebbe, and the question was whether Rebbe would prohibit the meat that was found in the hands of the guy, even though it came out of a Jewish butchery, because the butcher himself says that he sold the guy nevela. V'Yamar Rebbe lo kol amine. Lo kol amine means lav kol kamine. He doesn't have the power, the authority as a tabach. L'meisar makulin d'Tzipori, to testify that meat in the shuk in Tzipori is nevela. Lesar is called chanuya shel hagoyim mochrei habasa shereinu osam konami at tabachim Yisraelim. We know that people went in the Jewish kosher butcheries, they bought meat, and this tabach is not believed to declare that he sold nevela. And the Gemara now quotes Rav, and with this we'll wrap it up for today. Rav Nochis L'Tamon. Those Rav came from Eretz Yisrael down to Bavel. Chamsun Mekilin. He saw that they were very makil, they were very lenient in basar that was in the hands of a guy. The chamar alein, and he was machmer on them. He says, no, you're not allowed to eat this meat because this is called basar shenis alem mina ayin. And the Gemara now is going to bring a whole list of stories in which Rav was very consistent and he prohibited the Jewish people from eating the meat. Like, for example, we'll just do the first line here. Chad Barnash Ozil. One person went here on Daf Chaf Amid Aleph. Boy Mishizga Iskufe Bigo Nara, which literally means that Rotza Lirchos Lenakos Vimea Nor Chatichas Basar. He wanted to wash his meat in the river. Ve'itnisha intish inshasa the Ozale. He forgot. And he left some of it behind him. He was running away, he was in a very big rush. Chazar, and he went back to the river to reclaim that which he lost. Boy Mesvina, and he wanted to pick up the piece of meat and assume it was his meat, and it was kosher meat. Amalei Rav, Asalacha. Rav says, don't eat that meat. Dina Amar, because I claim that meat that you, for a certain moment in time, you were nisalem imenu, you didn't pay attention to it. So the meat that you had, which was kosher meat, shataf nara, was taken away by the flood, washed away by the river. The aisei chori did avela tachta, and the nevela was brought from another place and replaced this meat, and that's called basar shenis alim mina ayin. So it's possible that the river would wash away the original piece of kosher meat and somehow brings back meat of nevela to the same spot. Again, I would say that the chances statistically of that happening are close to zero, but this is the halacha of Rav of basar shenis alim mina ayin. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop on the top here of Chaf Amid Aleph, and in Mirza Hashem, hopefully over Shabbos, we'll learn Daf Chaf, and then we have on Sunday Yom Rishon Erev Rosh Chodesh we'll make a siyum on Masechet Shekalim. All right, Chaf Aleph is the last Amud. No, wait 1 second. Sunday, we do Chaf Aleph. No, my mistake. Monday will be Chaf Beis. So we'll have to postpone the Siyum till Monday. And then on Tuesday, we begin Masechet Yomi. Okay, then, so have a Shabbat Shalom. Everyone should have a great Shabbos.
Shalom. I apologize for the interruption.
No.